Okay, so thanks for moving in as quickly as you did. Some activity will still go on out there during the rest of this time, but I've put hopefully the speakers working in there so people in there can hear as well. We acknowledge we're on the land that always was and should be the land of the Kaurna people today. They cared for it and it cared for them. We acknowledge that our predecessors did not and we have not. We acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging. May we listen and learn from them. So, welcome to Journeying for 2023, the first one. 5 sessions in the year, and if you don't yet have a program, you can pick one up as you leave. And this year the theme is life's journey, beginning to end. And when you look at that program, hopefully you'll see those connections. Tonight we welcome Chelsea Size. Indeed, Michael and I and Chelsea met probably 12 months ago to talk about something, and both Michael and I were just touched by Chelsea and what she does and thought, we've got to get her to talk at Journeying. And so we'd arranged it last year, but then that didn't turn out. There are other things that came up. So we, as soon as we could, later in the year, we booked her for this year. So thanks, Chelsea, for making yourself available. Chelsea is I better read this to get it right. I'm reading her words, so it's cool. Chelsea's an ordained deacon who works as a spiritual care chaplain in residential aged care. She has recently completed a master's in narrative therapy, which in itself was something which I'd never heard of 12 months ago, and also community work, and is developing a project using narrative ideas to share people's stories of resisting overwhelm and sustaining, encouraging contributions in the face of climate crisis. Chelsea loves the red dirt, her and her husband, Jesse, and the 2 kids, exploring nature together and drinking cups of tea. Chelsea, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Peter, for that warm welcome. And I just want to also acknowledge the Kaurna people whose land we're on today. And just to say, it's for me, living in Port Augusta for 8 years, I journeyed a lot with different Aboriginal community there and call my wonderful family still today who are from that area, Adiamatna people from the Central Australia. Part of what I've had to, and I guess we all have as a journey, is to learn what it means to be Australian on stolen land, and what does it mean to follow Jesus in that context. So that's a continual journey for all of us, isn't it? And so just wanted to acknowledge Kaurna land here today. And to say Ninamani, which is hello, how are you? I love the song, I should sing it, but I won't. My kids sing it in kindy, and it's a wonderful song. So today I'm going to be having a conversation with you around curiosity and God and our ordinary stories of our lives. As Peter said, I've recently completed a master's in narrative therapy and community work, and that's going to kind of form some of the things that I share tonight. And also I'll tell a few stories of my life to give context to the ideas that I might share, so you can kind of get a sense a bit of who I am. To begin with, I think that curiosity is perhaps an underrated and essential life quality, and perhaps a ministry quality, perhaps a whatever profession quality. For me, holding on to curiosity and attentiveness underpin the way that I connect with God in the everydayness of my life. And curiosity, come in, welcome. Curiosity, it helps me think about the taken for granted ideas about myself and others and life. And it also helps me connect with parts of my story that I've never considered, and to help me richly connect with what I treasure, and to also to try and embody my faith. Sometimes it's so easy even when you're a part of a church, or if you study some theology or read books, is the information kind of comes at the cerebral level, and that's fantastic. But how do we then embody our faith or our values or our hopes? So this kind of emphasis on curiosity in my life has come along the way of life. It wasn't necessarily always an encouraged part of my life growing up. I grew up in Angara, where I'm like someone, where is the person who I'm there at the back there? I grew up in Angara, which is on the Eyre Peninsula, which is a very small town inland from Tumby Bay, about 15 minutes inland, or Port Lincoln, about 45 minutes from Port Lincoln, on a farm. And I grew up in a Church of Christ, a very small evangelical Church of Christ, a conservative community, a conservative church. And asking questions wasn't necessarily encouraged, let's just put it that way. So a lot of the things that I learned were really fixed ideas about who God was. That was pretty fixed. You know, the place of women in society, that was pretty fixed. Ideas about the way we interact with our community, or the values that we hold, the things we should be against and the things we should be for, they were set before me as quite fixed things. So there were many things that I wasn't encouraged to question. And actually, as I grew up, even into my early uni years, I was a part of an evangelical students group who really saw, I must say, Christians who were more progressive or who questioned some parts of the certain doctrines of the church as perhaps more dangerous than those people who were atheists or who were of another faith. I got that sense. I don't think anyone ever told me that, but I got that sense somehow that those Christians were the people to avoid. So probably I went past this church a few times and I was like, no, not really. But that's what I was told. Well, even if I wasn't told, that's what I picked up. So interestingly, it's a stretch picture, it's a little Polaroid picture. This is my dad. So alongside that story of kind of don't question things, take things as they are, just what we give you is the right answer and the true answer, and it's best not to deviate much from that. Alongside this story were other stories, of course, that ran through my life. And one of these stories can be traced back to my dad. And this is my dad, John, with his horses. He looks pretty young there, so he's probably maybe 19 or 20. So Dad introduced me to the practice and attitude of wonder and curiosity. Dad would get my brothers and I involved on thrilling adventures of perhaps helping to put a nesting box on the top of the local grain silo so that the peregrine falcon could nest there. And it did, and it was amazing. So year after year, we saw that. We would climb up the top and peek through this little hole at the very top of the grain silos. Dad definitely has been hit by it a few times trying to amend the nest. It was thrilling. And I grew flowers with my dad. He loves growing flowers, and so we would plant bulbs, and we'd have freesias, and we'd have roses for the table, and he even gave me a little section of the garden that I could plant the things that I like. He loved stocks as well, beautiful. And we raised chickens together. I loved the chickens, the smell of the grain when you kind of take the heavy lid off the big metal tin and you can smell the grain, and you go and give them the little baby chicks. They were so beautiful. And then Dad would take us camping in a local patch of the scrub. And it was just down the road. It was just a neighbour's property. But he would call it Secret Valley. So we'd go to Secret Valley and we'd camp among, we'd see emus and kangaroos would hop past our tents and we'd go bird watching, looking for nests, and it was literally 10 minutes down the road, but we were enraptured with this secret valley that we would go to. So this kind of led to a sense of interconnection with life and the natural world and with God. This kind of story going alongside the other stories was telling me something different. And I guess later on in my life, when I connected with some writings in my early adulthood from the Christian mystics across time, it kind of started to speak to me in these familiar ways, as if I kind of connected with these ideas that I'd never been taught before, but they resonated from somewhere. So I discovered writings of people like Jean-Pierre de Caussade with the Sacrament of the Present Moment, or Meister Eckhart, or Julian of Norwich, or Hildegard of Bingen, all these interesting people, or more recently people like Richard Rohr, who encouraged me to see, and us to see, spirit and matter as two aspects of a single cosmic tapestry. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, I don't know how to pronounce it, but amazing that we're not necessarily just spirit, but we have matter and spirit are united, that God inhabits creation and everyone and everything are in God. These ideas that had this resonance with me, it's like I kind of connected with them already. It was really interesting. So their writings and these stories of connection with God through creation, and indeed connection to the whole cosmos, it brought richness to my experience, not only of the world, but it brought God close to me, very close and very present in my day-to-day. And now I had some language and images that helped me to become more attentive and curious to God in my everyday, and to practice wonder and awe. So for example, this is an interesting little photo, to the left. They're nasturtiums, okay? So often we see nasturtiums, they've run wild, we don't want to plant them because they'll probably take over our garden too much. And they're lovely, but we don't always look at them. And then one day I was like, why aren't I cutting these nasturtiums and putting them on my table? They're beautiful. I had different colours and I cut them and put them on my table, and I thought, these are so beautiful and help me connect with the beauty and the richness of every day and God in that. And I remember going to work, working as a spiritual care chaplain in aged care, and showing this photo as a part of one of my a weekly service. And someone said, I've never seen nasturtiums before, look so beautiful. I've never thought of them as being beautiful. So now I had language to help me practice this wonder and awe even more. And for example, another very ordinary, very domestic kind of picture to the right from my house that I text my friends who probably thought I was a little bit odd. But I just was doing the dishes and I thought, this is beautiful, look at it. The bubbles had formed in this really interesting shape. There was this somehow delicate balance of this butter knife that I inherited from my grandma, the bone handles, and the kids' cup and one of my mugs, and the Tupperware. It just somehow spoke to me of God in the present moment. And with this curiosity and wonder, we are all capable of seeing the world and our stories, I would add in italics here, as wonder-filled. Esther Dewal wrote this, and it says it might mean opening our eyes to what we had not noticed, and perhaps something that hitherto we had not regarded as worthy of our attention. So where I'm going to go with this is to draw in the ways that we can be curious about our stories, curious about the small, perhaps neglected aspects of our stories as well. So as was mentioned in the introduction, and I mentioned before, I studied a master's in narrative therapy over the last 2 years. And narrative therapy was developed by two family therapists, Michael White and David Epstein, and really coming from Adelaide. But it's all about curiosity, essentially, and the many stories that shape our lives. I've got a few, not just the key points, but a few of the points that stand out to me about narrative therapy. So stories shape who we are. As we talked about today already, we talked about some of our places of sustenance. Stories shape who we are. We are all multi-storied people. So none of us are just a single story of something, are we? We've got lots of different stories that make us who we are. So a thing that narrative therapy, a kind of phrase that narrative therapy says is, the person is not the problem, a problem is a problem. So one of the ideas is to become curious about our problems and to resist pathologizing. So instead of saying, I'm useless, we might put the uselessness, these feelings of uselessness out to the side and kind of become curious about that problem. So instead of seeing them as us, we kind of are fixed in, aren't we? We see, I'm useless, so therefore I'm useless, so I can't do anything about it because it's internal. So it's encouraging us to kind of have this little bit of a distant look at our problems. And I love this phrase, this really always struck me, is a problem because it transgresses a value. I had to think about that for a while when I was studying. A problem is a problem because it transgresses a value. So there's this sense of going, what's this problem in my life? And sometimes we can actually turn around and look at, well, what is it that I value? And why is that problem, in my life? It maybe is pointing to something that I value. And of course, becoming curious about the stories that shape our lives. So this narrative therapy is about the many stories that shape our lives, the way we see the world around us and the stories that shape that, and the way that the ones we tell about ourselves, the ones we tell about other people, the ones they tell about us. And it's about understanding or becoming curious about where those stories come from, who they serve, and deciding whether we still want to give those stories weight in our lives. So I can't obviously teach you a whole master's course in this small time frame we've got, but just to try and give a little bit of an essence of some of these things that help reduce, can help reduce some of our problem stories and the effects on our lives. It doesn't reduce our responsibility. It doesn't erase the things that are going on for us, but it can help us understand our problem story as well as all the other stories in our lives and get in touch with the preferred stories of our lives. And we can tell our stories in ways that make us stronger. So how was it for you this evening talking about places of sustenance? Did anyone find some interesting or rich kind of discussions on their table about different places that their friends or their church members had experienced? A few nods. Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? These conversations were a part of one of my master's papers was, as mentioned, around how people are resisting overwhelm in the face of the climate crisis. So one of the ways that I would, help when I talk about things like the climate crisis, that's a huge subject. In itself, a conversation we can experience more overwhelm just by talking about it. So what are these places we can start from to help strengthen our position? And this was a part of that is thinking about questions and adapting questions that have already been developed that help us connect to experiencing our places of sustenance and what they have to tell us about our values and how we can be in conversation with them. So re-engagement with place and exploring our relationships to not just metaphoric place but actual places can be very enriching. So we know this is to be true from ancient Aboriginal First Nations wisdom, don't we? People like Reverend Dr. Auntie Denise, which many of you, Auntie Denise Champion, may have met or heard before. She talks about this kind of thing. And so I was really interested to explore how this could help us tell our stories in strong ways. And so I'm going to play, the other way. I'm going to play a little clip. It's got the quote up here, and you can hear her niece, Rani's voice reading out this quote. And I think it says quite a bit about the stories of the places in our lives.
I always say Australia is like one gigantic storybook. There's a story in every part of the land and sky and sea. When we, as Adjumatna, gather and tell our stories, we always say Yata Wandatha, the land is speaking. We also say Yata Wandatha Ikandana, the people are speaking as if the land is speaking. So, the land is speaking to us and through us in these stories. There's a oneness there. We are not separated from the land, our mother.
So perhaps you might like to continue that exploration. It might be stories from the past about places that have sustained you or places that sustained you at a particular time in your life. And I wonder what might be possible if we explore these rich stories that give room for the land, as Auntie Denise says, to speak to us and through us. Okay, I'm going to have another bit of a experiment with questions about our lives now. Has anyone ever composted before? Yes, look, this is so good. This is a good place to talk about compost, isn't it? So, composting. I know my husband has a love-hate relationship with a compost caddy on the counter. Anyone have that experience? I think, a few hands. I'm that type of person that loves to overfill the caddy. Yeah, I'm not that great at being so, I'm just going to get it out ahead of time. If it's 3/4 full, I probably should just, get it out now. No, it usually is, a pile on top of the caddy, another bowl with some more things, and, it could be just, growing from there. So it's interesting, isn't it, compost? And then I've read this beautiful reflection online when I was reading the other day about compost and the poetry of compost. I just want to read these words. This blogger wrote, "What happens within compost is pure poetry. A collection of disparate elements is gathered together and reordered into something new. A magical, semi-understandable process takes place that transmutes useless or discarded substances into something precious and life-giving. All of life's miracles are on show in this small, smelly square of your land." I thought that was beautiful. So, composting, and how does that connect to our stories? So, a part of a process that I engage with through my narrative therapy journey is using the compost metaphor, and that's been done before, so I've been adapting it to my contexts. So narrative therapy and narrative practice can be done with groups of people as well. So in some communities or with individuals, sometimes the conversations around certain types of stories might be useful to use this metaphoric compost idea. So we might imagine putting problematic or unhelpful stuff into the compost so it can become rich fertilizer for our lives and enable us to take further contribution or action in the world or become more aligned with our values. So I've worked with churches over the last number of years, and one of the churches that I worked with, I was a community pastor for about a year, and I went there, and when you're getting to know a new place, you kind of listen for what the stories that are being told about the place, and for a lot of people, they told me, we've got no one to pass the baton on to. And I've heard this story a lot, of course, around the church. We've got no one to pass the baton on to. We're declining, we're struggling, hoping maybe you can help us, in this very limited role. But we're struggling, we're declining. We used to have a Sunday school that was bursting through the seams. The kids would be on the lawn. So there was a really strong and real problem story. So I was kind of like, what can I do here? And luckily my supervisor, she's also done a master's in narrative therapy, and she's like, well, that's a clear problem story, isn't it? Like, I wonder whether you can use narrative practice to work with the community. And so we started to use some of the methodologies from narrative practice. And we imagined how, through a Tree of Life kind of workshop that's developed by other narrative practitioners, we imagined what stuff might be put in the compost. So one church reflected, in their words, our group used the image of compost to think about what we as a community would like to let go of and put in the compost pile to be turned into productive and healthy compost. We recognise that any productive compost pile needs to be turned and provided with air. What would turning be for us as a community? Perhaps one of the things is storytelling, to tell our stories, both of the ugly and the meaningful, and all those in between. What we want to hold on to in the future and what we hope to let go of. So it was really interesting. Even in the face of decline, this process wasn't changing the story, but it was changing the way we engage in our position to that story. So I wonder how we might hold on to curiosity in order to change our ways and change the world one person at a time. What stories might we need to compost in order to produce good fruit, in order to be fruitful? There's a really great book, which I'll have on the slide at the end, by a really wonderful narrative practitioner who works in communities called David Denborough, and he wrote a book called Retelling the Stories of Our Lives, and it's for everyday people. It's not for therapists, it's not for anyone particularly, it's just for anyone who wants to engage with these ideas. And he talked about this. He said, in any culture, there is a dominant belief system or story about what it means to be a worthy person, successful, or normal. It's like there is this invisible list of taken for granted ideas whose origins are forgotten. Some of us do reasonably well at conforming to these cultural norms. We get quite good at giving others the impression that we're pretty much together. We're relatively independent, and we've mostly made it in terms of living a productive life. Because of our ability to successfully project this image to others, people include us in the normal bunch, and this contributes to our feelings that we're of value. But it's not always a simple achievement, is it? In our efforts to conform to what might it mean in our society to be a real person, we're encouraged to keep rating and measuring ourselves against many standards and norms. How normal or abnormal we are, how healthy or unhealthy, how adequate or inadequate, competent or incompetent, and so on and so forth. There are so many cultural expectations we measure ourselves against, and often we don't even need anyone else to judge us. We do the judging ourselves, don't we? I don't know about you, but there are so many expectations that we live with day to day. For example, some of the things that I was thinking of. So to keep it together at all times. I come from a long line of emotional people. And to be honest, my mum would get up in our small church and she would often be quite emotional when she would share because she feels so deeply and she's moved so easily with a tender heart. And she was shamed, honestly. She was shamed for crying in front of people. And I would think as a kid, I do not want to be like that. I do not want to be like that. And it's such a shame. It's so sad that my mum had this experience of devaluing because she didn't fit in this stoic kind of a place of where people were supposed to be. So our other expectation maybe is to do as well or better, whatever in life, whatever that means, as my neighbours or my friends or my colleagues or my schoolmates. Maybe an expectation is to have children. Maybe an expectation is to speak in a certain way, or to go out with my hair always tidy, or to be able to balance career or relationships, family, keeping fit and healthy, caring for elderly parents or young children, keeping the garden watered, and all of that, with a smile on my face at the same time. Or it might be an expectation that I always handle myself confidently in social situations. The list could go on. Even today, I kid you not, I bumped into some people that I know, and I was so excited to see them. I hadn't seen them for quite a while, and we were out in a social setting, and I was just so excited. I was just chatting away, blah, 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 excited, getting connected, and we had to go. Anyway, so I left, and I sat in the car, and I was like, oh, I was too enthusiastic. I sat there literally thinking to myself and saying to my husband next to me, like, oh, I think I came on a bit overbearing, like I was too enthusiastic, I was just a bit too bubbly, I was a bit too happy. And he's like, well, what's the alternative, Chelsea, to just kind of like, hey, I'm cool, hi, I'm just really nonplussed to just like it. Who cares? He's like, it's better to be enthusiastic and show someone you're happy to see them. Like, it was already like in my head. As soon as I shut that car door, I just started to critique myself. So we've all had moments, I'm sure, where we find ourselves at the wrong ends of these continuums or of normality or success, or uncomfortably close to the bottom of one of these tables of normality. And in response to finding ourselves at the wrong end of these continuums, many of us work really hard to bring our lives in harmony with what is expected or seen to be desired. On little ways and in big ways. This quest can be quite exhausting and problematic in our lives and on the ways we see ourselves. And it can also get in the way of us living lives from our values, the things that we hold on to most dear. And in line with, if we are followers of Jesus, in line with the very countercultural ways that we read and we hear about Jesus living. I really don't think he was considered very normal in his day. So this is me, by the way, little Chelsea. So perhaps this is an invitation for us to be like anthropologists in our own lives, to start to question normality and hold on to curiosity, and perhaps we might think about the ways that these taken for granted ideas kind of operate in our life, maybe the ways they co-op us into thinking about ourselves, and just notice that. What about that word should? Anyone ever have those in their minds, the shoulds? And they shape us, and I wonder how these shoulds impact the stories that we tell ourselves about our own selves or others. I wonder these shoulds, how they impact all of us. So maybe this week we might take up the position of curiosity, and we can reflect. Maybe if you think about, maybe there's something you lay in bed at night. Anyone do that? Think about the day. Think about all the ways that you've embarrassed yourself, or that you haven't been smart enough, or all the things you should or shouldn't have said. I don't know. I do that. And I've wanted to learn to not do that as much. So maybe we can ask ourselves some of these kinds of questions. What's the history of this idea? What are some of the details of how this idea shapes your life or your community or your work? Because these shoulds could be a part of our communities as well. What is helpful and what is harmful about this idea? Who supports this idea? Who are its allies? Who benefits from it? Who does not? Is this idea connected with a particular school of thought? Are there laws or customs or institutions that support this idea? Does everyone you know follow this idea or at least feel its influence? And is there a different idea you would rather follow, and why? Another should that I grew up with was I was strongly influenced by my life in the church with I should be perfect. And this quest for perfectionism reminds me of a passage from Isaiah that says, "Why spend your money on what is not bread and your wages for what fails to satisfy?" Why was I spending so much energy in upholding this need to be perfect, this idea that I needed to be perfect, when not only did it fail to satisfy, but it actually got in the way of me leading a life that was courageous or honest, and I would have said they were parts of my strongest values. I remember all the way back to year 9 art, when my lovely art teacher would be leading us through an art example, and I would just say, "But what colour should I paint this part?" She said, "Chelsea, you can just paint it however you want, just whatever you." I was like, "Yeah, but what's the right way of doing it?" I was asking those ideas. And if I think about the history of this idea, I was actually being told very strongly in my upbringing and within the institution of the church is that to be perfect is to be the best Christian witness I can be. And I get that from one level, but it was also a very big strain for me to have to maintain that in some ways. So I was that third child. I have 3 brothers. I was the third child, and I actually maintained that air of perfection, the air of perfection reasonably well. My brothers were getting in trouble. They were the ones who were getting called up because they were drinking at the social or whatever. And I was just kind of cruising through, and people would put me up on a pedestal and say, "Oh, isn't she a wonderful Christian? Look at her," and doing all these great things. And I thought I was doing pretty good at this whole perfectionism thing. And then I started to realise it was affecting the way I was seeing not only myself but other people. I would have said I was the least judgmental person. I was so non-judgmental. But I wasn't. I wasn't at all. I would rate myself constantly against other people. Some of my friends were struggling. "Oh, I feel for you. Yeah, I'm glad I don't struggle with that." Just there was so much subtle ways that actually this idea was not only impacting the standards that I was setting for myself and that I could never live up to, but it was getting in the way that I saw other people, and it was also getting in the way of my, like I said, getting to the bed at the end of night and just thinking down to the minutiae of, was I too embarrassing? Was I too enthusiastic? Did I stumble on my words? Did I mispronounce that one? Did I come across smart? Did I come across dumb? Was I wearing the right thing? What would someone say when they, just like honestly, sometimes if you actually think about, if I would actually think about what I was thinking, there were so many aspects to it. And so along the time though, there were some people that helped me see this perfectionism from a distance, look at if it was helpful or unhelpful. And there was a beautiful man who was my spiritual director called Tim. And I would meet with Tim, and he just introduced me to this idea of God that I'd not really encountered before then. He said, God just doesn't just love you, God likes you. Like God chuckles with that fondness. And not chuckles like haha at you, but chuckles with that familiarity and that kind of like, "Oh, Chelsea." Like if you can understand and see and experience God in that way, what is it about the way that you're thinking about your own life or yourself that's different from that? And what would it mean for you if you actually, embrace that understanding of God or that experience of God, of laughing at yourself? That was a real massive revelation for me. I did not know how to laugh at myself, and sometimes I still don't, but I am getting a lot better. And my husband Jesse was really good at that, because he would, he's someone that didn't care about the way people saw him in the same way as I did. I mean, he's got other things, of course we all do, but I realised that actually these ideas of perfectionism were getting in the way of me being in the flow of life. You know that feeling like sometimes that you can flow into something and you just are how you are and you feel comfortable and you don't have that kind of voice in your head critiquing everything you do? Like, I wanted to be more like that. I really wanted to be more like that. And so along the way, there have been people who have been allies of this, resisting this perfectionism. And along the way, there's been people or ideas or institutions who have upheld and said, you should be perfect. And so I often I think I will always still have times where I recognise those dips and troughs and I become curious about my experience. So it was important for me to let some of these ideas become composted in order to change my way of life and align myself to the values that I held on to most dearly. And that's just me, because I sometimes think, like for me, looking back at those pictures of little Chelsea, this is me on the top of the car cleaning it, not denting. It was a very old car that we used to take to school and have wet wires and all the rest on the dirt tracks. But that sense of going, at that age, I was lucky enough to have a lovely, free childhood. So I wanted to try and get back to this sense of what being in the flow was like. But I could see the seeds of those ideas being planted already, don't worry. So I have no idea of the time, by the way, so I'm probably got heaps of time. But this is the invitation for us to become more curious about the small or overlooked stories of our lives and to find God in the everyday. For me, this curiosity has helped me to see God in the ordinary and to notice these taken for granted ideas that have been in my life that have been unhelpful and need to be composted, and to see possibilities where I had previously noticed only stuckness or closed doors. This has all directly related to my growth in compassion, self-compassion included, and non-defensiveness and non-judgment. And I think it's a continual process. There will be continual learning and growing. And by holding on to curiosity and attention in our ordinary lives, we can notice God in our everyday lives as well. We can cultivate practices of wonder and become interested in the details of our overlooked stories in our lives in ways that can help us to live from our values. These are some recommended readings. If anyone is interested in these kinds of narrative therapy ideas, this is a really great book, and you can buy online, called Retelling the Stories of Our Lives, Everyday Narrative Therapy to Draw Inspiration and Transform Experience. It's developed for everyday people, and it's a really beautiful way to engage with these ideas a little bit more. And there's just a couple of extra books that have been such small, little, beautiful keys to me experiencing God in the everyday. And I've put a book called Lost in Wonder by Esther Dewal and A Heart on Fire, Living as a Mystic in Today's World by Anika Spald. And just head to the Dulwich Centre website if anyone does want to know more about narrative practice. But now is really a time to say thank you for having me. And I would love to hear any questions that you might have, or even an idea or something that sparked your attention as I was talking. And I wonder what it made you think about your own lives and how you might like to kind of be moved in your own life with some of these ideas or phrases or thoughts.
Thanks, Chelsea. One of the things that sparked with me, or two things I guess, one was a book, Phosphorescence by Julia Baird.
Beautiful, yeah.
Which is all about awe and wonder, which
Love
is
it.
just amazing. The other thing is the concept of biophilia, which is the innate desire or need for humans to have contact with the natural world.
Absolutely.
And it's all about the fact that we are not apart from nature, we are part of nature, and we're part of, therefore, the whole of creation. And we have this incredible need to, and we talked about sort of our own experiences earlier around the tables, of it being in part of the natural world.
Absolutely. Do you find in your life that you've found practices and ways to connect every day in that?
Definitely.
Yeah. Do you have things close by in your backyard, or I guess in your living in this area, so you're pretty richly blessed with those natural places?
I do have a lot of things growing in the garden, most of which I've planted since we've been there. But we live opposite the Watunga Botanic Garden, which is an amazing place for communing with nature.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Hi Chelsea, my name's Heather.
Hi Heather.
I'm very fortunate to work in a classroom that has a lot of bushland right near it with lots of windows, and some of those windows get kept open for ventilation, which is great. There's a family of kookaburras who live nearby, and I run language classes, so we're doing a lot of talking. Quite often, if a bunch of kookaburras start laughing outside the window, the whole class just stops. And they just listen with this look of delight on their face. We usually do, we just stop spontaneously, we just go, oh.
It's so beautiful.
It's so wonderful.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that experience.
I'm surprised there aren't hundreds of questions, really.
Peter, sounds like you have a question.
No, not. Other than I am interested in how corporately we might look at small things and decide what things need to be composted or whatever, because I suspect that there are corporate things as well as individual things.
Yeah, narrative, as I probably mentioned briefly, but narrative practice is done in lots of different communities all over the world. So it's definitely something that is a big part of the Master's narrative practice, narrative therapy and community work. So community work is really core to that. And there are particular methodologies or different kind of exercises that have been developed, including one that I used with churches called the Tree of Life, which is a beautiful resonant metaphor for a church, a familiar metaphor, but using the Tree of Life to kind of tell us stories in strong ways that explore the roots, which is where we've come from, and then our everyday and our values and our legacies. And so it's kind of like a process that can be done with communities. So yeah, there's lots of ways that we can have those conversations can be had with communities, because there's heaps of stuff. We all operate with taken for granted ideas individually and as communities. Our churches are constantly coming up against them, and we've got lots of different problem stories or different opportunities to kind of look at as society changes, as society's engagement with church changes dramatically. How do we not just see that only single story? How do we be a multi-storied church and not just see a single story of diminishment? And I think there's a lot of potential using some of these ideas for communities. It doesn't necessarily change things, but it provides opportunities for us to reposition ourselves with the problem. Yeah.
Thanks, Chelsea. Can you give us a practical example of the way in which storytelling has been used therapeutically with a particular person in a particular situation?
I think so say if you were in a therapeutic setting, if you're using narrative practice ideas individually, there are lots of different ways that people can use that. So this is, I'm just drawing from the narrative kind of practice toolkit. There's lots of other ways people use storytelling. But often someone will come to see a narrative therapist or a practitioner with a problem. There's often a problem. So the one thing that narrative practitioners really hold to is that we will be decentered but influential. So we're trying to be really curious about the particular phrases and the particular words that a person is saying. So in that conversation, we're really being attentive to the stories that someone is telling and listening with a lot of curiosity and attentiveness. So I think that experience of going, most people who've experienced, maybe not most, but I'd say a lot of people who have experienced either therapy or being a part of the mental health system or being in a hospitalised setting often encounter experts. And rightly so. I'm not saying people aren't experts, but we're relating to people as experts. And sometimes we're being told by experts about our own lives in a way that might be pathologizing or it might be diminishing of us. So what narrative therapy proposes is that we centre the person that we're having a conversation with as the expert of their own lives. So the hope is that we're getting people in touch with, say we're exploring the problem. So that might be one way someone starts. You might come with a problem of that you're describing, and then you would look at that problem. So you might say, if we say that I'm helpless. So you might look at helplessness, and so kind of in externalizing, that's called, and looking at it as a curious thing of, how long has this helplessness been around for? Tracing the origin, like who is its allies? When do you find it most coming around? Like what kind of experiences do you have leading up to that? So you might explore those stories, but all the while we're also listening out for these neglected storylines or these other stories where helplessness wasn't as strong in someone's experience. You might be like, I hear you saying about that time you went to help, your sister with her kids, even though you were feeling the helplessness was really strong that day. And you kind of start, you kind of start to weave. It's almost like a weaving. And so you're hoping as a narrative practitioner to use really good questions, but really be listening really carefully with someone about their story and helping them to tell their stories ultimately in their preferred ways, in ways that make them stronger. And as I said before, that whole idea of saying the problem is the problem, the person is not the problem, is not necessarily to diminish responsibility or not necessarily to take away the problem, but it just helps someone resist that pathologizing. Like, we can totalize ourselves on the basis of those problems. And then if we are seeing the problem kind of at a distance, there's more room to kind of move and reposition ourselves in relation to the problem. So you might say, might ask a question of, how do you experience this helplessness? Like, is it, you don't assume, like, is it a good experience? Is it interesting? Is it unhelpful? Like, you're always asking that person's position. So I think over the course of, I don't know if this is answering your question, but over the course of a conversation, each person has the opportunity to tell their stories in a really rich way, because there's always questions that are curious about their lives. And so for my master's project, I interviewed a lot of people who were involved in climate action, so activists and other people who are involved in direct climate action. And I asked them a series of different kinds of questions, including the place of sustenance questions, to kind of hear how their skills and knowledges around resisting overwhelm and sustaining their action. And they came up with they had the most diverse different ways that they were doing that in just really everyday ways and being very curious. people talked about their sense of spirituality as well, so that was part of what I explored. Not so much ideas, but the ways that people embodied their spirituality. So I think, I don't know if that's asking because it's not a particular example, but people would bring lots of different ways that helped them, I guess, reposition themselves in relation to, say, the overwhelmingness of the climate crisis or the pervasiveness of what could they hold on to, what could they come back to. I'm not sure if that answers your question. It's not a particular example, but I guess it's depending on who you're talking to.
What about the small things?
In terms of...
In this context?
Well, I think most of us have probably, I know I have had times that I think of my life as fairly ordinary and fairly run-of-the-mill or a fairly lackluster or everyday. And I think the small things bit is linked back to the curiosity, is that if we can be curious about the small things that we do to sustain ourselves or the skills and the knowledges that we've developed, if we can richly trace those back and talk about the different things that connect with those stories, that actually helps us connect a lot more richly with the things that matter to us. So, for example, I might talk about something like, for example, lighting a candle, like every night that I do. This is a small practice, but I might ask, I might ask you about something about the history, like who introduced you to this idea? Was there anyone or anything? And so we might trace the history of not just the story, but the skills or the knowledges of someone all the way back, and then we start to have these conversations, connecting them to our values, connecting them to our hopes. And so I guess that's why I keep doing this, is like there's often all these dots of single stories, but narrative therapy hopes to kind of trace a bit of a line to strengthen the connections between the stories. Does that make sense? So you're always looking at small things, because otherwise you just think, I just do that, or I just go for a walk every day, or I just practice that thing that I tell myself that my grandma told me, or I just hold that image of, say, for example, a person I talked with my project. She had a really hard upbringing. I think she had like 6 kids in a caravan with her parents who were really volatile. And they came from a Catholic background, and there was this picture of, I think it was Therese of Avila. I can't remember which saint it was, but it was a picture of a saint up on the wall. And we talked about this, and we kind of talked about the history of this picture. And she would talk about what this picture meant to her, and she would stare into the eyes of this picture and see a sense of safety, an adult who was caring, someone who was holding roses that just kind of wove into her life. And she would talk to this saint, and these things. She's not necessarily religious. She doesn't identify as religious anymore, but she said that, that picture, that connection saved me at that time. Like I didn't have anything else. So, sometimes there's these things in our lives that we can just flip over or, just roll over because they're not important or perceived as important. And I think that's why I'm saying in narrative practice, as you're the expert of your own life, like I could come in as a therapist and give you lots of helpful tools, which is helpful to a lot of people, but sometimes you miss these small moments as well.
Thanks, Peter. Chelsea, I'm Marnie. I've been thinking about COVID and the enormous changes that have been thrust upon everybody, society, but in particular churches. And I know there's been a lot of hurt in churches over the things that we've had to give up and the things that we've had to change. And I know people just want to get back to the way it was, but I don't know that that's going to be possible. I think people are kidding themselves that we are getting back to the way it always was, but I don't think that's going to happen. Do you think that there would be some merit in churches actually having a narrative session or several sessions to actually look at the way we've changed and had to change, and the hurts that have been sustained by people, and what we actually might have to compost and what we can keep?
Yeah, absolutely, Marty. I think there's always opportunities to, because in all those things, there's lots of ideas that we don't always articulate around, you know, what we've lost, what we've gained, what's changed, what's possible to return, what is normal anyway, what is going back to normal, what does that mean for different people, what is it that you most miss about that sense of normality for you. It might be different for you as it is to Danny or as it is to Peter. Someone else might perceive that thing differently. So I'm sure, yeah, that would be really interesting to have some of those conversations.
Hi Danny, lovely talk. I was just really interested in your phrase of composting those negative aspects, because I think most of us can probably relate to the fact that having been brought up sort of after the war, and they having, like as you talked before about having sets of behaviours and expectations of people with really no wriggle room and no a level of opportunity for difference.
Yeah.
And so things were good or bad, and if you didn't fit, that was a bad thing.
Yep.
And then you had to make yourself somehow fit into something you didn't fit into. And I love that phrase, I'm going to use it and think about it, is to compost those areas of myself that need perhaps fine-tuning, rather than think of them as negative things, but they're actually the beginning of something good, isn't it? When you think about how smelly the compost can get before it gets better.
Yeah.
And when it does, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
The soil is rich and beautiful, you know.
Exactly, yeah. And turning, it might need some turning as well. So what would turning be for you? There might be things that assist that composting. It might be people or books or whatever, walks or...
Exactly. And the lady before talking about things that people have missed in the church because they've been used to a certain procedure or friendship groups or various things, but maybe that's part of the composting of actually us growing and being able to move into new things.
Yeah.
And from that, because we are creatures of habit, and I think as we get older we become a bit more like that, and a bit more perhaps enjoy those little routines, but sometimes that flexibility to do things differently or be with different people even is another aspect of our life as we move on.
Absolutely.
Children do it all the time, don't they? At school they move from one classroom to the next, and not always being happy when they do it, but then developing and growing and enjoying after that. So maybe we could see it as that, an opportunity for growth.
Definitely. And I think it's always helpful to put taken for granted ideas or any problem or skill in a context, because the stories that kind of shape us are always coming out of a particular context, aren't they? A particular time of the world, a particular culture, a particular family. So there's lots of different things that influence the types of stories that have shaped us, and everyone's a little bit different depending on when they grew up, where they grew up, how they grew up. So saying them out loud or identifying them out loud can be really helpful, because again, as the title suggests, taken for granted ideas or unspoken rules, or you don't always talk about them or say them out loud or articulate them. Yeah. Good luck with your composting. So part of my work, the way I integrate narrative practice into working in an aged care residential home is definitely talking about, it's a beautiful privilege to be able to talk to people about their lives and to have these skills that I've started to learn and I'm still developing, to be curious about these aspects of their life and to ask very detailed questions or to pick up on certain phrases. You know, for example, a person that I see regularly, they've talked about this inherited idea that they are mad, bad and sad. You know, that's like these three things that are kind of travelled through their life. And I got to ask a lot of questions around those things, and given the context of their life, you know, they've been able to reposition, you know, like change their position on that thing and resist some of that pathologizing, the labels that they've carried with them their whole life. And they've described that as being basically like it changed the way that they've seen their whole story. So that alongside the really hard things, that hasn't gone away, some very difficult things, but they've also noticed, actually, that connection I had with my grandpa when he showed me the National Geographic magazines, and that, although we had a struggling relationship on other levels, like that actually opened me up to the world and helped develop my sense of curiosity or love of learning. Or, I loved it when, you know, this is how I was as a young person. And, you know, just kind of repositioning things, and to see, as I always talk to them about this tapestry of going, if you've only got certain threads going along, you haven't got that like fuller picture of your life story. So if we can weave some of those different threads together, it's so rich and it's so beautiful to hear someone. And this particular person also had been, you know, experienced a lot of psychology and psychiatrists and all of the mental health system. And they'd never experienced having someone say, like, you're the expert of your own life, you know, ever. And asked about what their position was on that label or that thing that, you know, is it helpful or is it unhelpful or is it a bit of both? You know, just so I think at the end of life, naturally we look over our lives, I can imagine. I'm not there yet, but what I've seen is that we all look over our lives and think about the different things that have been a part of our stories. And so I think having someone asking those kinds of questions, and not only it's a joy for me because I hear these really rich stories, but I think people have said it's very helpful for them. And because I write notes, I write their phrases. So I will write a letter back or something using those exact phrases. So it's not me interpreting or making a professional judgment, but it's giving people back their own words as true as I can remember them. And they always have the power to revise them and say, oh no, that actually wasn't exactly what I said, or you misunderstood me there. So that's really been a lovely gift, I think, to bring as my part of my chaplaincy. So I use it in all sorts of contexts. I go from, you know, chaplaincy in aged care with older people to like the climate change, to my own personal life, to anyone who will listen. So no, I'm very enthusiastic about these ideas because I've seen them, you know, impact me and other people.
So Chelsea, final question from me. Earlier on, you used some words of Auntie Denise, and I wonder in your journey with narrative therapy, how much of an influence did the Aboriginal storytelling have?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's that huge, one of the really kind of transformative kind of stories of my life is just those moments where I went to Port Augusta, I studied occupational therapy as my first degree, went to Port Augusta on my final year placement, and I'd always driven through Port Augusta. I was telling the people at my table and just been like, get out of here as quick as I can, just drive on through. Never gotten off the main road ever in my life. And so I went on a placement and I worked in an organisation that was an Aboriginal organisation. And I thought I wasn't born that long ago, and I'd just been through all the school systems and all my uni, and somehow this was this encounter of going, I have no idea about the real Australian history and Aboriginal Australians and what it means to live on stolen land. I didn't even really think about it being stolen and never really asked a question about it. So I think that for me was also then asking the questions about society. Well, who's it benefiting that these stories aren't told more widely? You know, all of these kind of questions really were very informative on the trajectory of my life, because I kind of saw these stories unfolding, these taken for granted things that I'd been given, or these unspoken things, or this lack of, or this just silence in my education. So that's one thing. And then I think, going with Auntie Denise, walking on country, or just hearing yarns, getting to know people, and having continual relationship with, friends that are like family to us now, is that always connecting back to that long history. I think, learning a lot from people who, really connect with land and ancestors and ancestry and place. I think that has been a really rich source of learning for me, and it's also been such a life-giving kind of experience, because it's been that constant struggle for me to go, what does it mean to be Australian? As a, second, second peoples, what does it mean to live on stolen land? So that's been something for me, like a value, I guess. And so those relationships have really informed a lot of that. And so I think the storytelling aspect is so intuitive, isn't it? Like, for all of us, we all tell stories. We all get together with our family and tell the story about when Sally was 4 and she did that, or when Chelsea was 4 and I said, eating chicken around the table. This is a true story. And I said, I ate this chicken. I said, what's this piece, Dad? It was like a piece of gristle or something from the hot chook. And Dad just said, it's the chicken's bottom. And everyone laughed at me. Ah! And it was a funny story, but I actually found it quite weirdly difficult at that time. So but everyone tells these stories about, life. I think it's just the way we are. So yeah, I definitely have learnt so much in so many ways from connections with First Nations people.
Michael.
Chelsea, thank you so much for sharing with us tonight. It's been absolutely wonderful. Not only what you've shared about how you use narrative practice in your life and in your professional life, but also sharing your journey, which has been really fascinating to listen to, that journey from conservative upbringing through the mystics to a place of curiosity. And I made a couple of notes as you were talking, and I may have slightly got the wrong take, but a word came to me, that you've come to a certain place of playfulness.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
And instead of that, as you described it earlier, the perfectionism, maybe grasping after control, to actually kind of let go, to become playful, and that beautiful thing, curiosity. To me, we have something of a malaise of boredom in our modern world, where we need constant stimulation, likes, stimuli all around us, that we can't apply our attention with interest to something. And out of that boredom, I think, comes disconnection from the world. But curiosity is instant connection with what you're focusing on. And with that, also that connection to how you deal with problems. And I'm not the problem. The problem's separate. Let's get curious about it. How can we solve it? Maybe moving out of that helplessness, as you said. What a beautiful and life-giving approach to looking at life and the way that we perceive it, selecting a different story. So, Chelsea, thank you so much for your rich insights, for sharing your background. And we have a little token of our appreciation for you.
Thank you so much.
Please join me in thanking Chelsea.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
As Peter said, this is of course the first in our journeying series this year. We've got 5 planned, and they are a theme. These aren't just random. We work professionally here. We work through things, and the theme is that across the whole lifespan. And so this first session is sort of setting the tone, setting the making sense of the journey of life. And the next one will be journeying with children. It is going to be an exploration of how we can help equip children for the journey of life. How can we help them equip their own backpack for that necessary journey of life? We're going to have 3 wonderful, experienced childhood educators, Alison Sutcliffe, Heather Lee, Danny Mills, sharing right across the lifespan for children education. It's going to be a rich session. The following one after that will be journeying through generosity. Having filled that backpack as a child, having equipped the child for life. What do you fill the backpack for? To give it away. To give it away by living a generous life. What's it like to live a generous life? And Ian Hunter will be leading us through that. Later, we'll be talking about journeying through the rough, journeying through those difficult moments in life, those really hard parts of life. What do we do? Again, how do we make sense of those moments? And the final one will be journeying toward the end. How do we do as we approach life's end? How do we make sense of life looking in the rear vision mirror? How do we look at our life at that time? I think it's going to be a rich series of explorations. So I thank you sincerely for your attendance tonight and look forward to seeing you at subsequent events. Peter, have I missed anything?
Not really missed, not you, but I did. It's the beginning of the year, and we don't make a big thing of this at any time at journeying, but we do always have a bowl there if anyone wants to put some money in it to help cover costs. That's as much as I'm going to say in the whole year about it, so just letting you know that's it.
So thank you very much, and please join me thanking Chelsea again. Thank you.